Hey everybody, and welcome to another tutorial series for the procedural foliage placement tool. In this video we'll be taking a look at some of the new features that have been included in the 1.1 release. And here is what we'll cover today. First, we're going to take a look at a feature that was actually included in the initial release, a way of ignoring mesh collision, but it was done at the very last minute and I didn't have time to record a new tutorial for it, so we'll be covering it today. But basically, why would you want to ignore the mesh bounds when you're spawning your foliage, right? And we'll see an example of why you might want to do that. Then we've added some new scale settings. We've gone from only having the option to have a uniform scaling to now having full freedom on all three axes. That allows you to now add a lot more variety when you're spawning your foliage. We'll take a quick look at that. Another feature was the support for physical materials. Now you are able to specify one or more physical materials for your foliage, and your foliage will now look for those physical materials. And if you're not aware of physical materials, that's kind of a separate category of regular materials, which is really neat. You can specify a physical material on your landscape layer. We'll see how that's done. And you can actually specify a physical material on any normal material that you would use for your static meshes in your level. I've also implemented batch spawning, and what that means is basically that instead of spawning all of the trees at the same time, now we're spawning in batches, right? And the reason why that's useful is because if you're trying to spawn a lot of meshes, a lot of trees, use cases would be bushes, grass, shrubs, maybe little rocks, and you're trying to spawn hundreds of thousands of these. You don't want to do that at the same time. It'll probably crash your editor, right? So what you do is you spawn them in batches, and we'll show you how to do that in just a second here. But the second benefit is that now that we have that system implemented, now we can easily spawn your foliage at runtime. And that could be very, very beneficial because a lot of the times, if you have a massive world, you don't want to have a lot of trees or a lot of foliage spawn very, very far away, for example, which is obviously affecting performance if you're not going to see it. So super useful for runtime spawning. If you have procedural worlds that you're creating, right? Some games have the terrain created at runtime, and this is one reason why you want to do that. Another reason may be that you have actor blueprints that are quite heavy. So if you have an actor blueprint like the changing tree, you can't really convert those into instant static meshes because they have different components. So instead of having all those blueprints in your map taking up resources, you might want to just set your game up that to only spawn those blueprints when the player gets close. And we'll see an example of that. Okay, so if I jump over to Unreal, you should have the project open. This is just a test map that I'm going to be using to show you guys the new features, but you can just go ahead and open the showcase map or just create a brand new map. And here all I have is, as you can see, I've taken out all of the trees here, and I have one single spawner here, and we're going to focus on the hierarchical instant static meshes first. So the first thing we'll notice is that we have some of the snow trees. I'm trying to spawn about 4,000 trees in this area, and I have the collision bounds. And if I go down here, there is an option, as you can see here. It says ignore foliage collision. And we're not going to do that. We are simply going to, actually, you know what? Let's make this a little smaller to make it even easier to visualize. So let's just make this 100 by 100, or okay, fine, 200 by 200. And let's go ahead and press spawn hierarchical instant static meshes. And you see here that it's pretty dense, right? It's spawn trees, but you can see that it's still respecting the bounds of the foliage. And if I just keep spawning them, you'll see that it keeps spawning trees slowly, but eventually it gets to the point that you can still see that there's some areas here, right, that it doesn't want to spawn. So let's go ahead and remove all this, and let's see what happens if I click on Ignore Foliage Collision. It's going to be right here under Height Range. And now, if we go back here and click on Spawn HISM, you'll notice that it's now a lot more dense. And that is again because it's not taking into account the bounds. So in this example, the forest is super dense. Usually in my testing, it usually spawns about twice as many meshes in the same space. Obviously that'll vary based on the bounds of your mesh. But you can see here that you probably wouldn't want to do this for trees. This looks ridiculous. But again, if you had little rocks or shrubs or grass where you just wanted to cover an area and you didn't care about having certain overlap, that is what you would do. Another useful use case for this is when you're doing hierarchical spawning. Now there is a method, if you guys recall from the previous video, where I have hierarchical clusters. And in this method, you specify 3 different categories, right? High, medium, and low. If you use the ignore collision, what will happen is now you have the ability to spawn, for example, shrubs much closer to the trees, because now you're ignoring the collision of the trees. So think about this as anytime you want to have a lot of density, or specifically when you want to do hierarchical clustering, this method may be really useful, and it'll give you very nice results if you want to get all these smaller trees, for example, very close. Okay. All right. The second feature that I wanted to show, and we're going line by line here, is the new scale settings. And we're going to go ahead and remove this for now, and we are going to go ahead and remove the ignore foliage collision, and let's make this a little bit bigger. Let's make it 400 by 400. Make it a little bit bigger. And now you'll see here that now you have 2 new fields under collision bounds. You have min scale and max scale, and these are vector 3s. And this is the scale of the X, Y, Z, and these are basically bounds, ranges, right? The minimum scale and the maximum scale. And what the tool will do now is it'll pick a random scale per axis based on the bounds that you have here. So right now, minimum scale and maximum scale for everything is 1. But I can easily change just the C-axis. If I were to change this to 2, the X and the Y will be the same, but now the C will be between 1 and 2. So if I go ahead and press spawn HISMs, you'll see now that immediately you see that some trees are much taller than others, as you can see here. And my recommendation again would be to be subtle with the values. Usually between 20 to 30% is when you notice that it looks really good, but of course you have the option to do anything you want. So if you want it to be a bit more realistic, for example, you will see the max bounce would be, let's say 1.2, that's about 20% more. And then when you click on spawn, you'll notice that now it is subtle, but you can see that the trees are now different sizes, and they are also different widths as well, because the X and the Y are now different. So play around with the values, but this is a very good way of giving your trees variety, right? Very easy and in a very nice way to give you a little bit more mileage from your tree meshes. Okay, so again, very simple change, but it now allows you to scale your meshes in any way you want, not just uniformly. Okay, we're gonna go ahead and put this back in 1, right? And let's go ahead and remove all of these guys here, and let's see what's next. Physical material, great. So physical material, which I think you guys have seen before, is basically an actual file that you create. So if you go to materials, you'll see that there's a new folder called physical. And if you open it here, you'll see 3 things. there is PM soil, physical material soil. If you open it here, you'll see that you have some physical material properties like friction, restitution, that's the bounciness. If you're doing any kind of wheeled game, you have friction scale for tires, etc. Physical surface. So this is actually can get very involved. So I would definitely advise you to go and look for tutorials online on what the heck all of this means. But basically, you would just create a physical material, and you would right click and go to physics, physical material, and it'll just create this file here. That's really all you need to do. And then when you go to your terrain, you go to the material layers, and in your terrain you'll have different layers, right? And in this case I've used the soil layer, and if you open the soil layer file, you'll see that there is a slot for physical material, right? You have the layer name, you have the physical material, and you have some additional things here, right? So when you're creating your landscape, if you have a landscape with layers, you can open the individual layer files, so you can see here, and actually assign a physical material. So what that means is that now if I want to spawn my trees, I can now define the physical material where I want the trees to spawn. So there is a new section. It says spawn only on these physical materials, and it's right under spawn only on ground. And this is an array, by the way. So you click on the plus and click on the drop down, and you'll see that we have soil and test. And I think this is just a generic physical material that comes with Unreal. So go ahead and select PM soil, which is going to be the layers that you see here. And this will basically tell the spawner to only spawn if it finds that physical material present. So if I just click on spawn HISM, notice now that the trees are only spawning where the soil layer is, because the soil layer has the physical material soil assigned to it. And it's literally as simple as that. If I were to remove these guys and go to the landscape and go to painting, and I would just select the soil layer, you can see that now I can make some random shapes. And I'm literally just making this randomly here. And then I go back here and try to spawn the trees again. You'll notice that again, the trees are following the physical material layer. So you can see here. Now you'll notice that sometimes they're very much at the edge of the physical material, and that's because of the way the landscapes work. When you're painting your landscape, if you don't have hardness of the brush to 100%, there will be a part of the landscape that still is considered to have that layer, like in the borders here. And thus the trees will think, okay, there's a physical material there. So if you want it to be exact, make sure you select your hardness at 100%. There's also the other example, right? You can just drag in any mesh. So if I were to, let's just drag this sphere here just for fun. And I'm going to change this to, I don't know, 10 by 10 by 10. Let's make it a little bit bigger than that. Let's say 20. Okay. And right now, if I hit spawn, it won't spawn here because this doesn't have the physical material. However, if we go back to the physical materials folder and assign this physical material example, so go ahead and select it and click on the little arrow here, and you'll see that now this is assigned the physical material. This material, and let's just open it real quick, it's just a very simple material. It just has a color, a metallic, and a roughness. But if you click on the actual material here, you'll see that there is, again, a slot for physical material. And you'll see here that I've added physical material PM underscore test, right? And the reason I did that is because I wanted it to make a point. Even now, the trees will still not spawn on top of the sphere because this is a separate physical material. However, if I come here and I say I actually want to add that physical material as well, you can then go ahead and click on the plus sign here and add PM test as another physical material. So in your landscape or in your game, you can add as many physical materials as you want on a per foliage basis, right? That gives you a lot of flexibility. One thing to notice on the landscape is that the physical material will only be recognized if the layer is weighted. Okay, when you select your blend mode, you need to select it as blended, as weighted. If it doesn't have a weight, at least via blueprints, it will not recognize the physical material. So keep that in mind when you're creating your landscape layers. So now let's do something more fun here. Let's make this a little bit bigger, just to kind of drive the point home here. We're gonna make it 40. And if we go here, we are going to change the settings from max angle, say slope range, from 0 degrees to 40 degrees. Let's go ahead and make this, I don't know, 85. In other words, so it'll spawn all around the sphere. And we're going to go ahead and select align to surface, just to give the effect a little bit more, I don't know, it's just a little bit more fun. So let's go ahead and click on spawn HISM, and notice now that the trees have spawned all along the sphere. And the reason for that is because, again, this has a physical material that was included on the list. And we can keep on clicking spawn HISMs, and you'll see that it'll try to pack as many trees as possible within the physical material. Now remember, the spawner is still respecting the angle and the height that you've set up here, right? So just because you add now physical materials doesn't mean that the rest of the stuff is not respected. Physical material is just a filter. If it finds the physical material, it'll still make sure that it's within the collision bounds, it's within the slope range, and it is within the height range. So again, a lot of control. All right, let's go back. And now we're going to take a look at batch spawning. And for that, let's go ahead and remove everything. I'm going to remove the physical materials, by the way, so it just spawns everywhere. And I'm going to remove this. And let's just make this really big. So I'm going to make this really big here. Maybe, I don't know, 600 by 600 perhaps. Okay. And if I drag it down just to get an idea of kind of where the trees are going to be spawning. All right, let's just keep it there. And in this case, I want to spawn, let's say, 20,000 trees, right? Right now, you already have spawning, so make sure you click, if you haven't done that, make sure that show messages is selected, and that'll give you an idea of how many batches are spawned and how many are left. And you'll see that there is a new section called batch details, and go ahead and expand that, and you'll have two options. The most important one is the batch size. How many foliage items will the spawner try to spawn at the same time? You can think about it also in one frame if you're doing it at runtime. And right now the default is 5,000, right? The second value, runtime timer frequency, we'll see that this is used for runtime spawning. So we won't need to do that now. So we are trying to spawn 20,000 trees, 5 trees at a time. In other words, we'll have to do it 4 times. So if we click on the button, spawn HISMs, oops, and let's do it again. And again, oops, and again. And you can see that we have a lot of density here. So that's the reason why you might want to do that, right? Notice that if let me just go ahead and hit play here. Notice that my FPS is stuck at 120, even though we have 20,000 trees, more or less. And that's because, again, I'm spawning hierarchical instance static meshes at the same time. Let's do another example real quick, and let's go ahead and delete this. And this time we're going to do actors, and we're going to do the changing trees. And let's do 1,000 in that case. And we're going to do the batch size of 250. Okay. And these are actual blueprints. So if you click on spawn actors, you'll see that now the actors are spawning. There you go. All right. Okay, and now let's take a look at runtime spawning. That's the last example that I have here. And let's make this a little bit smaller. Let's make this 300 by 300. And we're going to move this back here. Just see if I can align it kind of here. Actually, you know what? Let's just put it here. There you go. In this area here. And we are going to see how we can do that. So go to blueprints, go to PFT _ spawner, and you'll see that there are two new blueprints, BP runtime despawn and BP runtime spawn. And these are, as the name suggests, blueprints that will start the spawning and despawn the foliage. So go ahead and grab runtime spawn and put it on your level. And in this case, I'm going to align it to the little road here. And under setup, you have three settings. One is what is the spawner reference? And in this case, you can click on the eyedropper, select your spawner. Spawn type, are you going to be spawning actors or instance static meshes? We're going to pick instance static meshes. And what is the index of spawning? Right, so remember, when you go to the spawner here, you have two different types of lists. You have actors list, that will represent the actors on the other dropdown, or HISM list. And inside this list, you can have several different items, right? In this case, I have pine trees, I have palm trees, and I have, what's the third one here? And snow trees, right? And this number here is the actual index. So when you're spawning from the actors list, you'll click on spawn actors, and this blue title will basically look at the actor index that you want to spawn. So if the index is 0, it'll spawn the pine trees. If the index is 1, it'll spawn the palm trees, and you get the idea. Same thing for the instance static meshes. It'll just use this index here. So these indexes here and these categories here are basically the equivalent of these settings here. We want to spawn HISMs at index 0. And when we do that, we'll simply start spawning the trees, and we will be using, in this case, that number here, the runtime timer frequency in seconds, to spawn the trees. So in other words, if we say that for HISMs, we want to spawn 20,000 trees, let's just make this a little bit, leave it at 20,000, right? And we want to spawn a batch of 250, and the timer is 0.5 seconds, what we're actually saying is that as soon as we hit this trigger, this spawner will spawn 250 trees every half a second until it gets to 20,000 trees, right? That's basically what we're saying. And if I just click on play here, you'll notice that I'm going to start walking. And as soon as I hit that trigger, you'll notice that we start spawning. And you can see on the left-hand corner the batching, right? It keeps on spawning the trees, and I'm going to eject and go up, and you can see what it's doing, right? And you'll see that it's just spawning one entity, two entities, five entities, because even though we said you need to spawn 20,000 trees, the area here is way too small for 20,000 trees. So it'll still keep going, right? It'll still try, as you can see, until it reaches that 20,000. But you can see the number of entities are basically almost nothing, right? So that's another thing to keep in mind, is you need to get a feel for the area and the amount of trees that are reasonable for the tool to spawn, right? You could try to spawn 100,000 trees here, and all you'll do is run that timer to try to spawn that amount of trees. Okay, and if I go ahead and process, you'll see that these are just hierarchical instance static meshes, and my frame rate is still very much very high, close to 120 frames per second, because I was spawning instance static meshes during runtime, which means that the performance is kept high. You probably wouldn't want to do this with actors, because the actors themselves will actually take a lot of performance. So let's do now despawning. So let's say that as soon as you hit this, you want to start spawning all of the trees, and let's go back and change it from 20,000. That's way too high, right? And let's make this 5,000. But now I want to despawn the trees when I exit the area here. So we're going to grab the runtime despawn, and we're going to set it right here. And all this blueprint does is take the reference for the spawner. So click on the eyedropper, select your spawner, and that's pretty much it. There's nothing else. As soon as you hit this, it'll just remove all of the foliage that the spawner had spawned. And if there's still a timer going, it'll actually stop the timer. So obviously you wouldn't want to remove it and then continue spawning. So if I click play here, you'll see that as I'm approaching the area, I eventually hit the trigger, trees start spawning, and as I am getting to the end of the area here, eventually I'll hit the despawn trigger, and the trees are gone. Simple as that. Obviously, in this example, it's pretty obvious, but you would want to make sure that you do it far enough, or you have enough line of sight obstacles that the player doesn't notice, right? So one use case is if you want to spawn individual actor blueprints, right? You don't want those in your level all the time. So the way you would do that is just the same way you would set up spawning pretty much anything, right? So under the actors list, index 0 has the changing tree, and we'll try to spawn 1,000 of those. Let's do 2,000 just to make a point here. Say that you have that on your level, and when you click here on the runtime spawn blueprint, you want to spawn actors at index 0. Now, you probably don't want 2,000 actor blueprints in your level unless the player is getting close for performance reasons. So in this case, we are actually spawning actor blueprints. So take a look at the frame rate on the top right, how it starts going down, right? And again, this is because these are heavy actor blueprints, and it's going to continue to spawn. As you can see here now, my frame rate went from 120 to about 50 to 60 frames per second, because again, these are actual actor blueprints. So this is another use case. You probably want to have specific actor blueprints only spawn when the player is close, and then when the player is leaving, in this case, you think about it as LOS or goes down the mountain, you want to despawn them, and look at the frame rate, it went up to 120 frames per second. So really useful, and gives you more flexibility as to how you want to spawn your foliage. All right, that is pretty much it. Again, we covered how to ignore mesh collisions, and that allows you to pack about twice as many trees in the same area. We are now using individual scale parameters for each individual axis. We showed you that. That means that you can have a lot more variety. I showed you how to include a physical material on your landscape layer or on a normal material, which can then be assigned to literally any actor in your scene. I showed you how to do batch spawning and how to change the number of the batch number and why that's important. And I showed you how to do runtime spawning, making sure that the timer and the batch number are appropriate for how many blueprints you want to spawn. And remember, all of these new settings can be applied to static meshes, hierarchical links and static meshes, or any blueprint actor that you want to spawn. All right, that is pretty much it, guys. I hope you enjoy this update. I did get, just so you know, a lot of these features that I've added came directly from requests from you guys, either from the Discord or email. So again, I'm always looking for feedback from you guys as to what are some of the new things that you guys might find useful. So if you're using the tool and you have a use case that you think would be really cool to add, do not hesitate to contact me. I can't promise you that I'll add it, but if it's reasonable and if it's general enough, I may consider it for a future update. So yeah, let me know what you think, guys, and I'll talk to you in the next video. Thanks a lot.